All right, well, thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Kluwer. He is a senior scientist for NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service. His hometown is here in Idaho, Fairfield on the Camas Prairie, where he's a fourth-generation farming family. He's got 30 years with the federal government, restoring rivers, removing dams, managing sediment, and he can maybe tell a little bit of story about where his career started and how much he finds the work rewarding here. Brian has his bachelor's degree in geology from the Idaho State University, master's in geophysics and groundwater from Northern Arizona University, and a PhD in earth resources from Colorado State University, emphasizing sediment transport and fluvial geomorphology. And with that, I will make Brian the presenter so we can look at his screen.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for that introduction, Gene. This has been a long and interesting road in river management from the Grand Canyon to the headwaters of the Salmon River and beyond. So it's been a lot of fun. And for those of you young folks in the audience, I encourage you to stay the course and don't be afraid of taking those twists and turns that may not be as linear as you thought they would be in your career. So the Stage 0 idea, this presentation is to give you the background on where that term came from and to help define it and to show you why it matters to fish. The term comes from this paper that Colin Thorne and I wrote in 2013. It was published in hard print in 2014, and it's part of a larger integrated model that we call the stream evolution model. And we also integrated on that geomorphic foundation models of habitat and ecosystem benefits, which is where the linkage to fish comes from. So our model started with 30, 40-year-old channel evolution models that were started by Shum, Harvey, and Watson out of Colorado State University as well. And they were focused solely on incised channels and how those incised channels were evolving, so that the people that were having this incised channel problem that was really widespread across the country, particularly in the Mississippi Basin at the time, could have some idea what to expect in the future. And so they came up with this 5-step model. Their stage 1 is a semi-equilibrium condition. And the H's here mean H is bank height, H sub C is critical bank height. And the idea there is that as the channel gets deeper, as it incised, that's their stage 2, the critical bank height becomes greater than the stable bank height. And so you start to get bank failures in addition to lowering of the bed, and that causes the channel to widen, which is stage 3. And that's kind of a positive feedback set of processes that result in an even bigger channel. I used to call it the runaway train syndrome, where so much energy gets focused in such a small space that it can't help but incise and enlarge. And that process just keeps going until the channel gets wide enough and enough sediment is coming from upstream channel incision and neck point migration to start to mute out those effects. And in stages 4 and 5, they saw a return to a semi-equilibrium condition. And so the channel is restored, or the low flow channel is about restored in its kind of its current or its previous configuration, but just at a lower elevation in a canyon, if you will, in the alluvial deposits. And really the reason this was useful is geomorphologists have this nasty habit of going to site visits and not wanting to look at the channel at first. They want to look around the watershed, and they want to look upstream, and they want to look downstream. And it's because they're trying to get oriented in these phases of channel evolution in order to make more sense out of the site that you took them to look at in the first place. So this is a picture of areas that really got the attention of these authors on channel evolution. And there was all kinds of bad things going on in floodplains in the Mississippi area. There was snagging and ditching. Snagging is removal of wood and riparian. There was forest clearing, there was draining, there was dike building, which you can see on the lower left here. There was undersized culverts and bridges being built that caused the fire hose effect downstream. And you can see that there were channels forming in places where there shouldn't even have been channels in these fields. And that red circle points out a previous culvert that has been washed away on a previous road crossing. So that's what Colin Thorne and I started with, is those stages. And Colin stayed on and studied these same streams for another decade in Mississippi and found that they continued to evolve beyond what the early channel evolution model predicted, which is not surprising. And meanders formed, got much bigger and wider. Inset floodplains formed, island bars formed, and a whole new riparian system would form at this lower elevation in an alluvial canyon. And I had been flying around the West for several decades, living in multiple states and being a pilot. And I couldn't help but notice that every alluvial basin had remnants of much wilder streams, river channels than any current condition. So this is a couple of examples. This is the Grand Ronde River. And you can see the meander skulls that show us that the river has, occupied the whole river valley at times in the past, but currently it's really isolated to its man-made channel with all the meander bends cut off. And progressively, these landowners are filling in these oxbow lakes so the farming is more efficient. And having grown up farming in Idaho myself, I could really, identify with these actions. We want our farms to be as efficient as possible, otherwise they're not profitable. And you do that by making your fields as uniform as possible so that crops mature at the same rate across all the acreage and you can harvest them most efficiently. And about the time that Colin and I were working together, this paper came out from Dorothy Meritz and Bob Walters. That was really an aha moment for a number of us. What this paper showed, that they did detailed radiocarbon dating of alluvial deposits in U.S. East Coast watersheds. And they found at the bottom of these alluvial deposits, they found well-developed soils and hand-cut tree stumps that are, the soils were on the order of about 10,000 years old. And the tops of these deposits are about 1850 AD. And so this whole packet of alluvium that a channel is cut into is actually reservoir legacy fill. And that wasn't previously recognized. And I'll show you in a minute why that's important. The channels are incised into unrecognized reservoir fill. It's not self-formed in their own floodplain deposits as previously interpreted. And what they found underneath the legacy fill in terms of channel and ecosystem processes is, before European settlement, the streams were small anti-branching channels with extensive vegetated wetlands and at times no channels at all. So this is important because these are the same streams, the exact same streams, where the concept of the naturally formed 1.5 year capacity meandering bankful channel was derived in the 1950s and 60s, and natural channel design is founded on that idea. For more information, I refer you to Dave Montgomery's comment on this paper, and he calls it Dreams of Natural Streams. And I'll have that reference at the end. So what Clure and Thorne did is borrowed from the channel evolution model as the foundation and added some stages that had also been added in years after it was published. There was a channelized stage that Simon and Hupp published, that's stage 2. There's an arrested degradation stage, which is really quite important, that Bledsoe published, that's stage 3 sub S. And we show multiple arrows because there are multiple pathways. This is definitely not a linear process in this model. from step to step to step doesn't explain every site. So there are pathways of channel evolution that go back to a previous condition. There are pathways that skip some of these states, and it can really be quite complex at a given site. But in general, these are the basic steps. You start with a single thread channel. The channel gets deeper because of some disturbance or because of channelization. It goes through steps of degradation and widening, followed by aggradation and widening, and back to a quasi-equilibrium, which is still a sinuous single thread channel. And what Colin added in the 1990s is this stage 7, a more laterally active, wider with a riparian belt, back channels in an inset floodplain. And what we added then in this paper is the previous and the after steps. So we saw plenty of evidence that a really not unchannelized version is evident in nature and was perhaps common before we started manipulating alluvial valleys. And that's our stage 0. And stage 8 is simply the same set of ideas and processes and ecosystem services, but at an inset elevation. So you'll notice that the previous channel evolution model was just about erosion. It wasn't about how the channel fits into its alluvial valley. And so we tried to bring that into our model, where these channels are part of a valley. And so deposition and storage is included in our model, whereas the previous model was stopped at incision, relaxation, and back to equilibrium. So one thing our paper didn't do very well is explain the scale. So, all of our figures have the same size of box, showing these stages all at the same scale, and that's really not the case at all. So I'll use this one example from Elk Meadow in Idaho to give you a sense of the different scale of these different stages. So the stage 0 scale is the entire valley. It's the whole width. And stage 2, a channelized stage, is just the narrow belt of the channel and perhaps a narrow riparian belt on both sides of it. And the valley that it's in is dry. And stages 3 through 6 are similar, but meandering perhaps, and they too are in a dry valley. They have a floodplain, but the floodplain is only inundated very briefly and infrequently. And on that otherwise dry floodplain, there may be potential floodplain channels and old oxbow lakes, but they too are small and not connected often or for very long. Stage 8 is the same idea as stage 0, but it's at a lower elevation, so it's scaled down version of stage 0. So the second part of the paper was to link the habitat quality and other ecosystem benefits to this geomorphic framework, and that was really kind of the main impotence for writing the paper. And to be honest, it was in large part driven by my own frustration that a whole lot of salmon restoration money was being spent on stabilization of incised channels, and from channel evolution concepts that just didn't make much sense because they're in a really poor condition when they're incised, and stabilizing them in a really poor condition was not a good expenditure of salmon money. So we made this linkage to habitat quality and ecosystem benefits based on literature. And in the literature, we found 26 hydrogeomorphic attributes and 11 habitat and ecosystem benefits attributes that we could link up to our stages. And we did that in tabular form and simply scored each of these attributes per stage and came up with these unfortunately really hard to read tables, but that's what you have to do. I'll examine, because it's possible to do graphically with photographs, this one attribute, which is shoreline length and complexity, and show you how we derived these scores for different settings. This urban stream with concrete line channel obviously gets a 0 score. This incised stream gets a 1 score for shoreline length and complexity. This mountain stream with boulders protruding from the banks as well as a meander band gets a score of 2. And this this stream with a lot of vegetation growing on the margins and much less of a defined channel, literally water kind of everywhere along the edge, hard to even define the edge, gets a score of 3. So we went through that same scoring scheme for all those different attributes. And table 5, the habitat and ecosystem benefits table, has a number of attributes that are directly related to salmon habitat, salmon productivity. Flood refugia and drought refugia are important ones. First and second order productivity and resilience are kind of possible to see in photographs. So if we go back to Elk Meadow in Idaho, Stanley is just over on the left side of the image here, just out of view. This meadow is perhaps in the best condition of any meadow I know of in this area. You can see in this early June photo when floodwaters are at their peak, you can see all the old paths of beaver dams. It's a mosaic of old beaver dams out there. And yet there are not any beaver dams in that area. The only beaver dams are in this most downstream area way off on the left side of the image here. And I think these are probably, perhaps 2-century old beaver dams that are still intact. And so this valley hasn't been incised or substantially disturbed, and these remnant features are all still visible here. So this valley is a great place to go for a hike, and I'd be glad to meet up with any of you when it's safe to do so next summer and go for a day-long hike across here. It is just really an amazing experience to witness all the different habitat features you can find in what looks like quite a monotonous landscape, and just how much water is stored here on the land. So I've drawn these polygons to show you the inundation area in the wet season, spring and summer, and that relaxes down to a smaller area, but still a very substantial area. Probably a third to a half of the area stays inundated through summer and fall. So on this framework for geomorphic processes and channel evolution that includes deposition and valleys and floodplains, we can overlay then these bubble charts of the delivery of hydrogeomorphic attributes and ecosystem benefits. And so each stage gets 2 bubbles. The one on the left is the hydrogeomorphic attributes. The one on the right is the ecosystem benefits and habitat. And the size of bubbles and the number of colors in them represents really their delivery of ecosystem benefits. So you see immediately that there's quite a difference between all the incised stages and the habit and the floodplain connected stages. And this XY graph of geomorphic attributes and ecosystem benefits really points that out nicely, where we have basically 2 clusters of delivery of ecosystem benefits here. We have really poor delivery for all the incised stages, and we have adjacent dry terraces and xeric soils. And these are all sediment supply limited channels, meaning that they have more capacity to transport sediment than there is sediment delivered to them. So they stay in that state for a really long period of time and actually get stabilized in that state and can just stay that way. And we also have been stabilizing them that way as part of restoration in the past. You compare that to the floodplain connected versions of our model, and they have a much greater delivery of ecosystem benefits. And these have hydric floodplains characterized by mesic soils, and they're transport capacity limited systems. So they're storing sediment, storing water, storing carbon, and really producing a rich ecosystem. So I've been thinking about this more over the years since we wrote the paper, and trying to think of different ways to explain the difference between those incised states and the connected states, or stage 0 and any of the incised stages. And I really think it's a state change that explains it. So let's think about a disturbance, say a flood or a drought. You would expect a relatively small signal in the stage 0 condition because it's very elastic, it's very resilient. There's a large area for disturbances to be spread out across and perhaps not even be detectable as compared to any of the alternative channel forms that are single thread and high capacity. That same disturbance can have a large effect and does have a large effect, a large signal, because these are brittle systems. They're not resilient. They have unreliable habitat because of that, and they're damaged by those very same disturbances. So we don't have a lot of time to go into historic prevalence, and I'm happy to visit with anyone later or after the workshop to go over more examples that back up this historic prevalence idea. But where we find stage 0 now is in some kind of oddball places. And this one here is the Humboldt River, which is a beautiful example of a stage 0 river valley that's quite extensive. I think it's about 50 miles long. It's at a really good climate zone for farming. This is the fall and there's water in the channel, so it's not a water problem. What it is it's a salty soil and not suitable for farming. So it has not been damaged by man's activities. And we don't have to go too far back into thinking about our land use impacts to realize that we probably really exploited and damaged our alluvial valleys more than we did other parts of the landscape, starting with the beaver industry, which extirpated beaver in most of our mountain watersheds 200 years ago. And that was followed by gold placers, which left a signal we can still see and easily read. And that was then followed by grazing and then logging and all kinds of bigger machine powered impacts to our alluvial valleys. Logging had a particular focus on its impacts in the mountain streams, where the streams were originally used as actually the transportation corridors to get material out of the mountains, with flash damming, splash damming in the channels, which had a tremendous impact that has not been reversed. And after we got railroads into our valleys, we ran the rail lines right up the stream bottoms as well. And so the streams were the transport corridors up until about the 1960s, when we finally got logging trucks powerful enough to build roads on hillsides and not run right down the valley bottoms. And in the valley bottoms, the transportation corridors actually became the streams in many cases. This is an example from North Idaho, where you can see running up the middle of the image here is a old and abandoned logging railroad spur. And you see the channel, the incised channel, running exactly parallel to this railroad alignment. And it's because these railroad beds were built with little mobile steam shovels that actually built their bed by creating ditches on one or both sides as they worked their way up these valleys. And so the transportation corridors in alluvial valleys became the streams. And this alluvial valley has been restored last summer. So our great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers really believed that the valleys needed to be drained. And there are all kinds of really interesting and really kind of heartbreaking publications you can find on the internet that show you how to do just that, how to straighten streams, how to divert the tributaries, and shows you where ditches should be placed to drain wetlands, with the whole goal of lowering the water table. And this diagram here is really kind of fascinating in its simplicity, and it really indicates as well what we're all trying to do, trying to reverse, which is to bring the water table back up towards the surface in our alluvial valleys. One thing I've begun to notice a lot on the landscape that you may not be aware of, I think Johan will have an example of it coming up, but there's a stream channel stuck over on one side of the valley, and it's often quite deep, high capacity, and really quite simple. And that's because those are man-made channels. There was a nationwide effort to drain alluvial valleys, and we did that often by pushing, building new channels over on one side of the valley in order to drain the valley most efficiently. And this LiDAR image shows us an example of that. Myself and others have done a lot of work quantifying the habitat losses in California's Central Valley, one of the West Coast's biggest historic salmon habitats. And here's the historic stream channels are shown in blue, and the historic floodplain is shown in green. And the floodplain was immense. It was about 4,500 square miles of floodplain and 17,000 square miles of stream. And here's what exists today. These numbers of single digits are very similar to what Tim just showed us from the Chehalis example, where the current habitat is down to well less than 10% of its historic condition. So California really took draining wetlands seriously, in part because it's of course a great growing climate, large population growth and opportunities there, and really large wetlands to work in. And so the blue line stream channels in these valleys actually were vast wetlands and perennial shallow lakes only 100 years ago. So you can imagine the ecosystem changes that this has brought to the Central Valley. So these red states show states that have lost more than 50% of their wetlands between 1780 and 1980. And Idaho is one of those red states. We often turn to historic ecology studies to help us understand what conditions were like before disturbance, because we don't have good documentation. Even the General Land Office surveys, although they're very informative, they weren't completed early enough to get all of the disturbances unraveled. So historical ecology studies are one way of doing that. And this group out of California, SFPI, has done 19 studies across this range in California, and 13 of those have evidence of stage 0 components in their valleys. And we're seeing historical ecology studies show us the same kinds of results from Europe, from the Eastern US, from Colorado and the Pacific Northwest. And a couple of examples, recent ones out of Europe, the lower Siret River in Romania. This is a really nice 150-year series of images showing the transition from multiple thread channel, high floodplain connection to single thread channel. And the Danube in Austria, very similar, 300-year history recorded here. So to summarize the impacts, European settlement and land use has enlarged channels in order to drain the land, has converted deposition zones into transport zones, therefore converting wetlands into dry uplands, and seriously diminished historic salmon habitat. Where we find stage 0 streams today, they're found where the growing season is too short to farm. So in this color-coded map up here, those white zones are where there's not enough frost-free days to commercially farm, and that's where I see, and flying across the west, still many examples of stage 0 valleys. We find them also where the soil is bad, the Humboldt River example I showed you earlier, and where systems are so big or so remote that it hasn't been feasible yet to channelize them. So if you want to spend some time flying around in Google Earth, you can find still many examples of stage 0 settings. So one of the impetus for writing this paper and really bringing attention to this stage 0 concept was that we often have insufficient restoration targets, and the shifting baseline syndrome, which I've seen a lot of literature on recently, is a really good concept for helping us think about how we progressively have diminishing perceptions of what natural is, which is in large part, I think, why we have insufficient restoration targets. And also restoration is often not planned by folks who can read and understand the landscape that they're setting out to restore. So how does stage 0 directly support some audits? It supports in many indirect ways, but directly, supports them through a high water table, which delivers a prolonged hydro period, and a fully charged hypereik zone, which helps control temperature and nutrient flow. It delivers large, long-lasting, and reliable habitat that's resilient to climate cycles and changes, and very extensive and heterogeneous watered areas with networks of islands and channels and antibranches that have multiple marginal deadwaters and great hydraulic diversity. Basically, anything a fish could want can be found in close proximity. Very high water quality through the deposition of suspended solids and dissolved solids, cycling of nutrients, and temperature control through hypereik inputs and vegetation overlying it. A diverse and mildly dynamic bed with lots of hydraulic diversity, so it delivers numerous well-sorted bed material patches. And because unit stream power is limited, spawning gravel patches are much more stable and not washed away during high flows, like is common in the single thread channel versions of these alluvial valley streams. With diverse sediment and hydraulics, we get support of a diverse food web that has the highest biodiversity and proportion of native species, drives first and second order productivity, has high unit productivity and large productive space. And that can be seen in examples like this food on the floodplain study that Katz and his co-authors did in the Central Valley of California, comparing floodplain zooplankton production to the adjacent canal and Sacramento River and how fish respond to that. Basically, there's 100 times more food on the floodplain and 10 times greater abundance and rate of growth of fish living on the floodplain. And they're resilient. So annual to decade scale disturbances are really non-events in stage 0, whereas and less frequent watershed disturbances are absorbed without damage, including flood and fire. And you'll see an example from Kate coming up after lunch on that resilience. And it's largely because there's a large accommodation space. All the processes are not concentrated in a channel. They're spread out across the whole valley. So as a way of summarizing some of the ideas here, harmful events actually can become resource inputs. So in the incised channel versions of alluvial valley streams, floods can scour redds from the bed because the bed gets scoured, can flush juveniles downstream to unsuitable habitat. Sediment can bury redds, and suspended sediment has water quality problems. And annual inputs to these systems disrupt the ecosystem and upset the first two life stages of samanids. Compared to stage 0, the state change idea, the highly floodplain connected stages 0, 1, 7, and 8 don't scour redds because there isn't focused energy in a concentrated channel. Floods do carry juveniles onto food-rich, quiet water areas. Sediment doesn't bury redds, and sediment deposition of suspended sediment improves water clarity downstream. And the inputs are absorbed and enhance the ecosystem that supports the first two life stages. All of these ecosystem services are summarized in this diagram in a paper that's coming out hopefully in 2021 by Ellen Wohl and a number of us as co-authors, titled Rediscovering, Reevaluating, and Restoring Lost River Wetland Corridors. This also refer you to this paper by Hauer et al. 2016, which shows us that the fully connected gravel bed river floodplain supports everything from nutrient processing to supporting bugs and all the fauna to bears. It's really an interesting and useful paper. So my key points are, historically, it was common for alluvial valley river corridors to include wetlands, and the river wetland is probably the most harmed and most important part of the freshwater ecosystem. And stage 0 is a large, wet, rich, resilient condition that supports large salmon populations. So how is stage 0 being implemented? You're going to see some examples coming up from Johan and Kate. And there are different ways of approaching stage 0 restoration. There was a question earlier to either Tim or George about that. And I've put together this spectrum diagram to try to include all the different approaches to it that we have used so far. There, of course, will be other approaches, I imagine, to go into this diagram in a few years. But over on the left, these are all process-based approaches, and over on the left is process-led, I call it, because it's harnessing the power of processes to do the work is its intention. And over on the right is process reset, which is just taking the large capacity channel and its constraints off of the landscape and letting deposition processes be reset. So it's process-based restoration across an entire spectrum here, from hand labor on the left to heavy machinery on the right, and variants in between. So the things to consider about this spectrum is the scale of the problem and the scale of effort and the time to results is different from one side to the other. Over on the left, a deeply incised situation may take multiple interventions and may not even be possible if it's deeply incised enough. Whereas over on the right, the process reset approach can address these really horrible problems, and you'll see some examples of projects like that. They can do it in one intervention. And I really think, the choice of which way to go is multifaceted, but part of the calculus that goes into these choices is permits. Can you get a permit for one-time intervention, which I think is more the norm, as opposed to a permit for multiple interventions, but I think is kind of hard to come by. Funding falls in kind of that same category. Funding is usually for short-term projects, and it's really, I think, difficult to get funding for multiple episodes of habitat restoration in the same location, but that could be shifting. And so ownership and staffing, I think, are key components of what choice to make here too. And I don't think any of us in this workshop prefer one choice over the other or promote one choice over the other. It's all good work, and anything we can do to get our floodplains fully functioning again is good for the mission of restoring salmon. So there are resources I want to bring to your attention for the low-tech process-based approach, the spectrum on the left side of the diagram, because we're not going to talk about those anymore today, but there's really good resources out there. There's the Joe Wheaton et al. Low-tech process-based book, which is only a year and a half old. Pollock, Beachy, and others have a paper in Bioscience from 2014, which lays a really nice foundation for incremental addressing of incised channels. So I refer you to those, and there are other resources available. I've got a number of references here. We don't need to go through those, but they're available. And if there's any time for questions, I'm finished there.
Chris had asked the question, what are some of the largest existing examples of stage 0 rivers that you're aware of, and how big? Meaning,
can you say that again?
Volume. Yeah, Chris had a question of what are some of the largest existing examples of stage 0 rivers that you're aware of, and how big, meaning discharge volume, are they?
Oh, naturally occurring, undamaged. Yeah, we find them. Well, you find them a lot on the North Slope, and they're massive, right? So stretches of the Yukon, the last 200 miles of the Mackenzie, the Lena in Russia. They run the whole size scale from massive to little. And the examples here I've shown, I know are little. They're mountain meadows, but really some of our biggest river systems fit in the stage 0 category, and they've stayed that way because it just hasn't been feasible yet to dredge them and channelize them. The Mississippi River being a good example of streams of the scale that had stage 0, delta systems on them, but have been completely destroyed by channelization and encroachment.
And Paul adds the Amazon River.
Yes, the Amazon's a good example. And there's examples in Africa too. They've escaped development for now.
Other questions for Brian? We do have some time for questions, so again, feel free to unmute your microphones and ask away. Or you can chat in the chat box.
Hi, Brian. This is Lydia Blyfus from Trout Unlimited. I really like your idea that we have progressively diminishing perceptions of what restoration is. And I'm wondering if that idea for you links back to George Pess's comments on monitoring and lag times for being able to just statistically link restoration to improvements and how we report back to funders or get funding in the first place for these projects.
Yeah, that's a good question. There really is, the institution around restoration is not very well set up for processes that may take a long time to show results, and for projects that may take a number of years to implement because of the scale needed. So I think the restoration world is trying to scale up, is learning how to scale up, and sees the need for it, but it's difficult. And but I think the other point that I was trying to make is that, we can't even conceptualize what restoration would be most useful because of our diminishing capacity to understand what natural is. So that's a little bit different aspect to the problem of the time lag.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Is there anything in the chat, Gene? My screen's so small I can't see it.
Oh yeah, Ryan, it just popped up. Do you think this type of restoration is possible in a heavily developed basin like the Big Wood River to show a population response?
Another good question. Infrastructure limitations are real limitations. The idea of stage 8 has been applied in areas where we have spatial limitations, and I think there are some really large spaces left in the Wood River Valley that definitely could see this kind of restoration done on them. I'm particularly thinking of some series of gravel pits below Bellevue that is, if you will, ruined land, and it's what 20 feet below the historic surface, so it may actually be at a good elevation if it were connected to the river to create stage 0 floodplain. But I think there's plenty of space out there that is not urbanized, not industrialized, and with this concept presented properly, I think there's plenty of places in the Wood River Valley where this will work. There's some areas in the upper Wood River Valley above development where I've watched in the last 5 or 6 years single thread channels go to stage 0 systems because beaver moved in. So it depending on the scale, it doesn't take any intervention by humans other than letting beaver do their thing.
Great questions, great discussion. Anyone else with another question? Okay.
Hey, Brian.
Go ahead.
My name is James Paris. I'm a PhD student at Idaho State University, working in river floodplains. And so using the Big Wood River as an example, if you walked laterally across a gravel bed river floodplain, would you find different evolutionary stage channels across the floodplain coexisting, or is it kind of like what scale are these channels occurring at in these evolutionary stages?
Yeah, that's another great question. So the really active, glacial landscapes delivering a lot of coarse sediment. If you think of a classic Alaskan valley downstream from an active glacier that's retreating, you have island braided systems and no vegetation, with the vegetation progressively marching up valley and turning those island braids into anastomosing channels. So you can expect to see that scale of channel in the Sawtooth Mountain valleys, and I normally show some examples of that in this presentation, but didn't have the time for it. You can also see, meander scrolls across the entire valley width in the Wood River and the Salmon River valleys, where those indicate, big meander bends, but relatively small capacity channels because they left behind a lot of their sediment, right? These are depositional valleys, not transport valleys. So I think you can see channels of all scales, but not of the scale we currently have, because we've created transport scale channels.
And Brian, Sarah asked the question if slope has been found to be a limitation for Stage 0 projects.
Another good question, and I think I'll just defer to the next presenter, Johan, who's going to go over a series of examples from Oregon that have been implemented across the landscape in different climates and different slopes and different geologies and at different scales. So the short answer is no, there's no slope limitation. Alluvial fans are, in our paper, we classified them as Stage 0 streams as well, and they can be quite steep.
Okay, and maybe either you or Johan can also get touched on urban streams. Doreen with the City of Boise wants to know if processes like this can be restored in urban valleys, such as the Boise River. And I know Johan's presentation is where does it belong on the landscape, so maybe we can get back to that if possible.
Yeah, and I would comment on the Boise River. I've worked in a number of settings in the West Coast where we've looked at alluvial valleys that are as developed or more developed than the Boise River. And with development, we often find, series of gravel pits along the river that we're currently managing to keep them isolated from the river. And I'm working with a group in California now who's in the phase of permitting and seeking funding to take 400 acres of gravel pits that have been managed to be isolated from the Russian River and reconnect them to the river, not just reconnect them, but re-level them at an elevation that will be functional to the currently incised and encroached upon Russian River and create 300 acres of active floodplain out of industrial wasteland. So when I fly over the Boise Valley on my way to Stanley, I see that opportunity in the form of all those gravel pits that we don't have a good management strategy for. And that is land that I think really is a huge opportunity if we envision it properly.
And regarding that Boise River, Tom talks about a field trip that's coming up. Thanks, Tom, for plugging that. That is hardly a Stage 0 project. It was some log jams that we installed, and we did create some pool habitat, but definitely not a Stage 0. But there is a tour coming up here on the Boise River. And Tom asks, can you elaborate on how you would use gravel pits adjacent to the river? Lower Boise has a bunch of these.
Yeah, you have to do a couple of studies, and the first study is you really need good topography and bathymetric topography, and you need to figure out if you were to level the available land, would it create a floodplain that's functional to the current river? And to everyone's surprise, in this Russian River example in California, we found that we could create a floodplain that was inundated seasonally for around 90 days on average every winter. And then be an emergent marsh wetland in the dry season, which is ideal for coho and steelhead in that climate. So with that topography, you just do some grading examples and modeling the landscape to figure out what's possible.
And how do they function in winter? With someone asked, how do you think historic Stage 0 waterways function in the winter, and do they ice over?
That's a good question. Oftentimes, even this example I show you, what I think is one of the best Stage 0s, the Elk Meadow example. there is a small and persistent channel in most places in that valley that I think stays, it ices over, but I think it probably has, doesn't ice clear to the bottom of the bed, although I don't know that for sure. Shallow water is going to freeze deep.
Mm-hmm.
There probably isn't going to be a lot of water in these, certainly in these high mountain settings, but in the warmer climate settings, I think you'll see some examples of how it's it's handled in Oregon in the warmer climate settings. But in Idaho, everything freezes to the bed.
And Robin asked a question that we can think about throughout the day as well. Are you aware of any tools that might be useful in identifying and prioritizing watersheds where stage 0 restoration could be feasible and most beneficial?
Yes, and I think Paul Power's example of how we can use LiDAR data to read the landscape and to try to put it back together and find those pieces that have been taken away from it is perhaps the best tool. And LiDAR is now available in just about everywhere, although not in these high mountain areas of the upper Salmon, but it's available all over Oregon. It's available for large chunks of Idaho and Washington. And Paul's example of the Pacimero will show us how to go through that. And I'm going to end the day with an air photo evaluation.
Just as I took your screen control away. Hold on a second.
No problem.
Just moved it over to Johan, so now I'm giving it back to you. Okay, show us the photo.
Well, I don't need to show you a photo. You can go ahead and switch screens, Gene, but at the end of the day, I'm going to show you how we can use air photos and the knowledge that we have about, what stage 0 conditions look like on the ground and what remnants are still there to help calibrate our eye of